and welcome. Thank you so much for coming to our MLK Day lecture event, or maybe I should say our lecture in honor of MLK Day, since we're having it at the end of the month. We have a great program in store. I'm just really excited. I had the chance of reading our speaker's book, and it was just really stimulating. So I'm excited to hear what everybody has to say about it. Before we begin, I just want to say a thank you to all the people that made this possible, the MLK Day committee, and Rashana Fernando for doing so much of the coordination. She likes to sit in the back and not get acknowledged, but we are indebted to her and John Norris as well for their help in coordinating all of this. So without too much ado, one more thing, I want to acknowledge thanks to the McDermott Fund for making this possible. Without it, we would not have been able to bring Dr. Bukola to campus. So thank you very much. And I will now turn the program over to Dr. Stockard.
So much. Welcome to the 2022 MLK Day address, the annual address in honor of Martin Luther King and his Jr. and his life, work, legacy, and spirit. I would also like to recognize the MLK Day Committee's chair, Associate Provost John Norris, and his office's administrative assistant, though I just heard you don't like to be acknowledged, so I apologize. Rashana Fernando, without both of whom the event just would not have. Thank you both, and please join me. We're fortunate to have with us this year Nicholas Bukola, Professor Elizabeth and Morris Glicksman Chair in Political Science, and the founding director of the Frederick Douglass Forum on Law, Rights, and Justice at Linfield University. I didn't expect him to be quite so young. He's done substantial and significant scholarly work in Frederick Douglass, one of our core authors, but we've invited him to present his most recent work, The Fire is Upon Us, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley Jr. and the Debate Over Race in America, published by Princeton University Press, 2019. One way to approach debate, especially controversial debate, is to engage in it directly on the topic itself. But another approach is to study great debates on the topic. And I find this to be a very promising approach. And tonight we will do just that, the latter under Professor Bukola's guidance. The format of the evening will be this. After Professor Bukola's 50-minute address, Debating the American Dream, James Baldwin, William F. Buckley at Cambridge, our own Associate Professor of Politics, Jonathan Culp, will offer a 10-minute response, after which two of our students, Maya Campbell, an IPS politics student, and Prince Ogodu, an economics major pursuing an MBA, will each offer a 5-minute response. You will notice that I indicated to the audience the amount of time that you're allotted, and I will actually be setting an alarm. We would like to close more or less at 9, so that you can have the rest of your evening, especially those of you who are students and have homework to do. After a brief exchange among them, I will take questions and comments from our audience, allowing students to speak first. I will moderate the discussion. I first discovered Bukola's book preparing a student-led unit in my art and rhetoric course on the debate itself, wherein they, over a 2-week period, evaluated both debaters by means of the art that we had been studying. I found the book intelligent, compelling, and fresh for a number of reasons. I then sent him what I think technically is called a fanboy email, to which he graciously replied and said, well, if you'd ever like me to come to Dallas, just ask. And so when the committee asked around what shall we do, so to speak, it was a natural. Both Baldwin and Buckley have been very important for my own education. I can still recall the effect on me of reading as an undergraduate Baldwin's The Fire Next Time and being enthralled by his prose style. I was also enthralled by the subject matter, but both Dr. King and Malcolm X had already awakened me. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, awakened me, for fear of being castigated for being woke. But they both awakened me to the subject at hand. But Baldwin's prose style was something I had never experienced before. And watching every Saturday morning on PBS, Buckley's Firing Line, on which he conversed with and debated a diverse legion of intellectuals and writers, and being energized by his dialectical skills and his rather impressive vocabulary, by which he was also quite impressed. It's not too much to say that Baldwin helped teach me to write and Buckley to speak. And reading, writing, listening, and speaking are four just absolutely crucial arts in a liberal education. This leads me to a singular virtue of Bucola's book, truth-telling, which can be both the origin and also the result of intellectual charity. Make no mistake, Bucola argues in favor of Baldwin in the book, and I think he's quite right to do so. We can be right, and we can be wrong. And when we're wrong, it just has to be pointed out. Even so, he's fair to Buckley, and this actually found surprising in the book, pleasantly so, who in lesser hands would have played the villain, so to speak. And he treats his position, a position he utterly rejects, with real care, with real intellectual care. In the book's biographical parallel lives chapters before and after the debate and his analysis of the debate itself, he uses a controversial historical moment to understand our own present moment, illuminating the controversy by means of the civility of debate that our own President Sanford has reminded us is both a defining feature of the West and the best part of UD intellectual culture. Having shared a delightful meal with Nick and the other speakers at our home last night, by the way, Mrs. Kreider and I noted that his writerly ethos as a lively, thoughtful, and charitable persona is just who he actually is as a person. Please join me in welcoming as our UD guest and the 2022 MLK Day speaker, Nick Bucola.
Wow. I think it was King who said, a wiser man than I would not speak after an introduction like that. I mean, this is, I don't know how I can possibly follow such a gracious introduction. Thank you so much, Scott. So many people to thank, and I want to, I made a little list here so I wouldn't forget. Trang and Scott hosted me for that dinner last night, which was marvelous, and I really appreciate the hospitality. It's my first in-person talk since the pandemic began, and so I've been so excited to be back on the road, as it were, and it's just been wonderful to hang out with the folks here at UD and the students, and there's a list here: Scott, Roshana, John, John Norris, and then we have John Culp, Prince, Maya, JD helping out on the tech. Thank you, everybody. I feel so welcome here, and I'm just so excited to share this work with you and have a conversation. As Scott mentioned, we have quite a lineup of speakers after me, so I'm going to get to it. I want to start us out in this space. This is the Cambridge Union in Cambridge, England. This space is a remarkable one. It's not actually all that big. It sort of looks big, you know, on video and in photographs. But this space on February 18th, 1965 was absolutely packed. There were over 700 students and guests of the Cambridge Union, one of the world's oldest debating societies. It was a 150-year-old debating society at that time. Every spot on those benches was filled. All the spots upstairs in the gallery were filled. It was so packed, there were students on the floor, on the hardwood floor. You could hardly see the hardwood floor as the debaters walked into the hall. And that night, February 18, 1965, most of those students were drawn to the Union to see James Baldwin, who was one of the most famous writers in the world. Baldwin was, in the words of his friend Malcolm X, the poet of the Civil Rights Revolution, the leading literary figure who was associated with the movement, was doing so much to reshape the country and really the world at that time. But the students were also intrigued by the prospect of seeing Baldwin share the platform, as it were, with William F. Buckley Jr., somebody who was not internationally famous yet. He would go on to achieve international fame in large part due to that television show Scott described. He would host that for 33 years, and that premiered in 1966 after this debate. But Buckley was famous, certainly in the United States, second only to Barry Goldwater as a kind of face associated with the conservative revolution or counter-revolution. Buckley was, in some sense, the poet of his revolution. He was the leading writer associated with that movement. He was really the founding father of American conservatism. And I'll talk a little bit more about the role he played in sort of founding a conservative movement in this country. And Buckley was really the perfect person to share the stage with Baldwin. They were invited to debate the motion, "The American Dream is at the expense of the American Negro." And there were no figures who were better suited to square off, both in terms of their life experience and their way of thinking. And so it really was a kind of intellectual prize fight on this international stage. The BBC is there to record it. It would go on to be, played in the United States on television and around the world. The New York Times was there. All these newspapers are there to cover it. And this intellectual clash was happening in the midst of the Selma campaign in the United States. So across the ocean, in Selma, Alabama, and around Selma, Alabama, folks are fighting for the right to vote. The same night, February 18th, 1965, the same night that Baldwin and Buckley square off, in Marion, Alabama, there's a protest that's depicted very powerfully in Ava DuVernay's film Selma, if you've seen that. And there's a small group of protesters protesting the arrest of one of their leaders. And that night, they're confronted by Alabama law enforcement. And Jimmy Lee Jackson, a 26-year-old church deacon, is murdered that night. He's mortally wounded by Alabama law enforcement. So that's happening across the ocean the same night Baldwin and Buckley square off. And what I say in the book is that juxtaposition of those two things really captures what the book is about. I set out to write a shorter book about this night, Baldwin at Cambridge, sort of trying to capture how did they get there that night, what happened that night. And I realized pretty quickly that there was a much bigger story to tell. Baldwin and Buckley you can see the book's pretty thick. This is the paperback, but it's a 400-pager. And the reason it's such a bigger book is because the backstory, the story of how these two men came to be who they were before that night, was really the heart of it for me. The debate itself is, I start the reader out in this space, like I just did with you, but then they have to wait 250 pages to get back to the Cambridge Union. And as Scott said, I sort of did this parallel lives thing where these guys are born 15 months apart from each other. And I try to give the reader a sense of who they were growing up and how they came to believe what they believed. And as Scott said, I try to be fair and just tell the truth about the story as I see it. And so tonight I'm going to give you a little taste of that. And hopefully, I think our conversation, I told my host that now given a lot of these talks before the pandemic, all traveling all over the place, and then since then, a lot of virtual talks, and there's always plenty to talk about. So I'm happy to stick around and chat with folks as long as you'd like tonight. So let's get to it. This is James Baldwin, born August 2nd, 1924 in Harlem. Baldwin is somebody, if you're familiar with his writings, you know that Baldwin wrote a lot about his childhood. He wrote a lot about his experience growing up in Harlem, both fiction writing that was inspired by his life in Harlem and also a lot of nonfiction essays. Baldwin was really committed to the idea that, autobiography, writing about oneself, there's a lot of truth to be found there for one to be honest about what we see when we look inside ourselves. And Baldwin describes a life in Harlem that was really marked by domination. Baldwin, says that if you want to understand what it was like for my mother and my father and stepfather, who was the only father he ever knew, the thing you have to know is that they struggled each and every day to feed their kids. Baldwin ended up being the oldest of 9 siblings, and he had 8 siblings, and he sort of played this quasi-parental role. And so he sort of watched his parents very closely and tried to get a sense of how this world around them that was communicating to them through the millions of details of every day, as Baldwin would say at the Cambridge debate, that their lives didn't matter quite as much. So Baldwin watches, especially his father, really consumed by this domination, which he says sometimes had a human face. Sometimes there were police officers and landladies and landlords and insurance agents and police, all these different folks who communicated to them that they were marginalized and they should be marginalized. Baldwin says there's also a kind of domination they experienced that didn't have a face. He refers to the bottomlessly cruel structures of power that limited the freedom and opportunity and well-being of folks like his parents. And Baldwin really says that the thing that comes through most powerfully in his autobiographical writing is really the face of his father, looking into the eyes of his father, who he says came to believe what the white world said about him. He saw his father really consumed by despair. Baldwin's father became sort of, he started to hate himself, and he sort of was cruel to most of the people around him. Baldwin says, I think most powerfully for me, I was first reading Baldwin's autobiographical writings. He said, I can never remember a single instance when any of my father's children were happy to see him come home. And as a father myself, that just broke my heart. And Baldwin says, over the course of his life, he had a very contentious relationship with his father that I'll say a little bit about in a little while. But Baldwin, he really tried to understand how had the world done this to my father, and what can I do to escape his fate? Right? Baldwin watches his father really die a death of despair. He ends up losing his mind and ends up dying in the asylum. And Baldwin sees that could be his fate. And so he sets out to try to avoid that fate. And what Baldwin says is he's trying to, make sense of how does one avoid that fate? How can he avoid that fate? He says one looks for a handle, a lever, something to hang on to, some way of fighting back against this system that's keeping you marginalized. And for Baldwin, that handle, that lever is language. I love being at places like UD where there's this devotion to the written word. Baldwin was a reader from a very young age. He read everything he could get his hands on. And he was a writer. He started setting pen to paper at a very young age to try to make sense of his experience. And Baldwin really wanted to, he was really fascinated by the power of books to connect people across time and space. So he could read an author who had a very different life experience, but when he found something that spoke to him in terms of making sense of who he was and who he might be, he was very moved by that. And Baldwin was also, one way in which he followed his father, his devotion to language was found in the church. Baldwin was a young minister. His father was a lay Pentecostal preacher in Harlem storefront churches. And Baldwin, very powerfully in Down at the Cross, the major essay in the book The Fire Next Time, describes his very dramatic conversion experience. He was raised in a very religious household, but really didn't feel like he was a Christian until he was about 14 years old. And so he describes from the age of 14 to the age of 17, what it was like to be a young minister. And I always like to point out to audiences that, Baldwin's, the things he describes in his fiction, nonfiction, some of it is very, this sort of experience of domination is definitely a major thread, but also there's a story of resistance. Baldwin talks about the ways in which he was able to connect with his church community, for example, and find sort of moments of solidarity, moments of resistance that gave him a sense of what the future might be. So I love, he talks about the sort of feeling that he would have when he was in the pulpit and connecting with his congregation in the word, right? The church begins to rock, Baldwin said. And so something about the power of language, the capacity of language to connect people and to change the world. I think that really is another central theme that I want to start us out with as we think about Baldwin. Meanwhile, William F. Buckley Jr. Is born 15 months later, and I should say, just as a transition, although this is going to be a story, this first part of the story, especially a story of contrast, Scott and I were talking about last night, there's a way in which there's a lot in common between these two characters, even though they're so radically different. So Buckley is born into a very, very different world, but Buckley is also, devoted to language and devoted to the idea that language can change the world. But Buckley is born in New York City, same city as Baldwin, but as I say in the beginning of the book, he may as well have been born on a different planet. Baldwin describes in his childhood, he says one of the words that comes up a lot is claustrophobia. You know, Baldwin describes sort of being told that one cannot leave a particular geographic space, what it's like to have that feeling of being limited, to what it's like to be in an apartment that's far too small for a family, for your family. Baldwin describes sort of imagining a room with a windowless room, where you're sharing a bed with several of your siblings. This is the kind of claustrophobia Baldwin brings to mind when he's describing his childhood. Buckley, on the other hand, describes seemingly limitless space. He ends up spending most of his childhood at a place called Great Elm, a 47-acre estate in Connecticut. And he describes his childhood as idyllic. I mean, it's sort of an amazing, he's riding horses and he's swimming and fishing and doing all these different things. And he has this beautiful estate where he's living, and his family, they're mostly homeschooled, right? So he had 9 siblings. He's sort of right in the middle there in that lineup. And they were homeschooled, and his parents really provided he and his siblings with a kind of liberal arts education right there at the estate. So they had live-in tutors, a couple of live-in tutors that were there, lots of servants serving the family's every need, and then visiting tutors to provide. I mean, the sort of curriculum at the Buckley estate was remarkable. I have in one of the footnotes the list, one of his siblings provides from A to Z, all the different things that they studied at home in those years. But most importantly, for the purposes of our story, the Buckley children are taught a particular worldview. And the Buckley family was Catholic, and that was a central part of Buckley's upbringing. But there's a relation to this other part of the worldview that we'll discuss over the course of the evening. But the other sort of part of the worldview was the Buckley family called individualism. And this was a kind of moral and political doctrine that Buckley and his siblings were taught by their parents. Buckley's father, as many of you know, was a Texan. He had made and lost and regained fortunes in real estate and oil, both in the United States and abroad. And Buckley's mother was a self-described proud daughter of the Confederacy from New Orleans, who came from a wealthy family down there. I like to say to people that, the basic description is Mrs. Buckley had old money, Mr. Buckley had new money. The key word there is money, lots of money. And they had this very, very strong worldview that they wanted to teach their children. This idea of individualism was kind of a catch-all term for them. And I think it's a really interesting idea, especially to think about next to their Catholicism. But it was basically meant to capture their hostility to a lot of things. Communism, they were deeply anti-communist. Socialism, but also liberalism. They were staunch opponents of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the New Deal. And I think, probably most importantly for the purposes of this story about the clash with Baldwin, they were suspicious of democracy. The Buckley children were taught that certain people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. And good news, Buckley children, you're fit to rule. And one of the really important aspects of that philosophy for the purposes of the debate with Baldwin is that view was thoroughly racialized in their household. So the Buckleys had this estate in Connecticut. They also had an estate in South Carolina. And Buckley's William F. Buckley Jr.'s generation, they look back at their parents, they write about their parents, they say, by any definition, our parents were racist. They taught us to believe in a kind of racial hierarchy. But this is something that's really important to William F. Buckley. It was a particular kind of racism that they taught us. It was a kind of noblesse oblige, kind of a racial paternalism. So Buckley was taught by his mother especially, and by his father in other ways, that they were superior, but they had an obligation to take care of those people. So this commitment to a kind of racial hierarchy was something that Buckley grew up with. And that's important to know. And one of the things that rankled him a great deal in the 50s and 60s was a sort of conflation of the kind of racism his parents practiced with a kind of demagogic, kind of segregationist racism that they saw as rooted in animus. So for Buckley, the intention mattered a lot. So he thought of his parents as having a kind of benign, paternalistic racism that there was something different about that. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind as we go forward. So this is the part that for the sake of time, I'm gonna say less about than I would in the sort of the long version of this talk. But Buckley goes on he goes to a prep school in Connecticut called Millbrook, and then he goes on to Yale, and famously he proves to be a rebel on campus at Yale. So he shows up there in a pretty conservative place, but he is discovering when he gets there that there's far too many professors, especially who are promoting a liberal agenda. Does this sound familiar? And so Buckley is he's sort of one of the major things that he does when he's on campus is he becomes chairman, as they called it, or editor-in-chief of the Yale Daily News. And so Buckley is a kind of very happy to engage in debate with others, and is happy to call out his professors. So he uses his chairmanship of the Yale Daily News to write about international politics, about domestic politics. The election in 1948 happened when he was there, and that was a very interesting election. But he's especially interested in campus politics. And he writes editorials about professors who he thinks are promoting a kind of liberal bias. And Buckley ends up going on famously to, one of the first things he does after he graduates, students don't get any ideas, is he writes a book-length indictment of his alma mater called God and Man at Yale. And in that book, he's not against professors indoctrinating their students. He's against professors indoctrinating their students with the wrong ideas. And so Buckley says that Yale, like many other institutions, is marked by a paradox of Christian individualist parents sending their children off to be converted into atheistic socialists, is Buckley's critique. And he, at Yale, has somebody I have to mention, a very important mentor. One of the professors who was the exception to that rule was Wilmer Kendall, who ends up at the University of Dallas, of course. And Kendall is a really important figure in Buckley's development. I want to say something about Buckley's next book, and then say something more specifically about Kendall and his influence on Buckley. So Buckley writes that book. It's actually, it's panned by most reviewers, which Buckley kind of likes. But he proves to be kind of impossible to ignore. This young guy who's willing to take these very strong views. If that wasn't controversial enough, so the book kind of, is famous or infamous for a critique of academic freedom. And essentially Buckley says academic freedom is a legitimate concept in the realm of research, but not in the realm of teaching. That, alumni, the alumni and boards of trustees ought to sort of play a larger role in what is being taught and who's doing the teaching. And so Buckley is it's quite a controversial book. And if that wasn't controversial enough, his next book is a co-authored defense. He co-authors this book with L. Brent Bozell, whose family also has some connections to UD. And they write a book in defending Joseph McCarthy, right, who's leading the latest Red Scare at the time. It's not a full-throated defense of McCarthy. They acknowledge some of his flaws, but they believe that McCarthy, and this is something that they learned, I think, in part from Professor Kendall, is playing a really important role in enforcing a public orthodoxy. This idea of public orthodoxy is really central to Buckley's worldview, and it ends up being, I think, something that is, Kendall's especially important in helping him understand, which the basic idea is that any sane society, I think, Kendall argued, is not a completely open society, that societies need to have a kind of moral glue to hold them together. So it is legitimate, not only legitimate, but necessary to have sort of guardians of a particular orthodoxy, a particular moral and political orthodoxy that will hold the society together. And Buckley, that's the role he wants to play. He wants to be a guardian of the sort of the faith of our fathers, as he'll say at the Cambridge debate. And so he's much more, as a debater, even early on in his days in prep school and at Yale, he's much better in a kind of defensive mode, taking on critics, than he is defending his own views. And even some people sympathetic to him would point that out, that he was not particularly comfortable defending why he believed what he believed, but he was more than ready to take on all comers. And of course, that's one of the reasons he had his sights set on Baldwin. So Baldwin, right around the same time, this is one of the things about the story, is that they're coming of age, so to speak, intellectually, right around the same time. So when Buckley's at Yale and then writing those books in the early 50s, Baldwin is establishing himself on the intellectual scene. And he ends up leaving the United States in 1948 and spending most of the next 9 years in Paris. And Baldwin says he never considers himself an expat. He says he's a transatlantic commuter. He says he had to leave the United States in order to survive. He had to leave the United States in order to really understand it. He wanted to write a kind of autobiographical novel, but he found himself unable to do it in New York, in the United States. He really felt like in order to survive, he needed to escape. He needed to have that kind of critical distance. But Baldwin does write his first novel, which is called Go Tell on the Mountain, and it's a really excellent book for those looking for some Baldwin to read. And Baldwin describes, a family much like his own, and he tries to give the reader a sense of what the world looked like through their eyes. But he says he's really trying to avoid what he called protest fiction. Baldwin, we had mentioned a discussion last night about the relationship between art and politics, and Baldwin is really what he's worried about, what bothers him is a kind of art in which the sort of humanity of one's characters gets subsumed by an ideological agenda. So Baldwin it's clearly a story about race. It's about, racism in a lot of ways, but Baldwin is trying to get at something underneath the sort of what we see politically, what we see above the surface. What is underneath all of that? And it's a remarkable book in which it's really a meditation on his father, trying to understand his father, imagining his father's history in order to make sense of the man that he grew up with. So it's an amazing story. Baldwin he writes his second novel, which is Go Tell on the Mountain is 1952 or 52, I think. And then his second novel, Giovanni's Room, comes out in 1956. And this is a novel which is very different. Baldwin goes back to some of the same people who worked with him on Mountain, and they refuse to work with him on Giovanni's Room because, and this is the Baldwin, paraphrasing these publishers that he worked with. They said, "Jimmy, you are a promising young Negro writer. Why are you handing us an all-white gay novel?" Is what the line that you got from a lot of publishers. The Giovanni's Room is the story of a white American named David who travels to Paris and falls in love with an Italian bartender named Giovanni. And it's a novel that tells the story of their affair, from its enchanted beginnings to its bitter end, is kind of the way I describe it to people. And it's 1956. Think about the controversy of that book, and he's unable to find an American publisher at first. It's published in the UK initially, and then eventually published in the United States. But Baldwin's response, I think, is really important and telling. And just thinking about what he's up to, what does he mean by this? His desire is to be an honest man and a good writer. He says, "Go Tell on the Mountain." Race is, kind of a subject in that text, but it's not really about race. Baldwin would argue. It's about what lies beneath, right? What lies beneath racism? What is actually producing this sort of attitude in our culture? And same with Giovanni's Room, that the fact that Giovanni and David are men is relevant to the story for sure. But Baldwin says it's a story about what happens to someone when they refuse love. That's what it's about for him. So he's my frame of reference. My primary concern is the freedom and fulfillment of human beings. And what I want to know is what is inhibiting the freedom and fulfillment of human beings? And what can we do to liberate ourselves? And so Baldwin's really obsessed with a kind of nexus of three things: identity, morality, and power. Who is it that we take ourselves to be as individuals? What constitutes our identity as individuals and as members of groups, as members of nations? Who do we think we are? Is the kind of Baldwin question. And how does this conception of self lead us to treat other people? Those are kind of the questions that Baldwin is after. And so that just gives you a little bit of a sense. And this is Baldwin's doing this in his fiction and in his nonfiction. So Buckley is having some success with these books early on in the 50s, but he's frustrated. And so many authors in the room can relate to Buckley on this point. He's frustrated by the glacial pace of book publishing. It takes a while. And Buckley wants to have an impact on day-to-day politics. And what he decides is he first gets a job at a magazine. He thinks journalism is the way he can do this. But remember, some people are fit to rule and others are fit to be ruled. Buckley was not cut out to be anyone's employee. And so that lasts about 4 months. So you might find this, Prince, when you get out there in the world, you're like, you know what, I need to be in charge. And so Buckley, wants to start his own magazine. He recognizes the role that magazines have played in American political culture on the left. In the early 20th century, magazines like The Nation and New Republic really played an important role in shaping the progressive movement and eventually having a big impact on public policy. And so Buckley thinks to himself, what I need is a magazine that can help make a movement, right? And so at that time, there wasn't something we could call a conservative movement in the United States. So Buckley really sets out to create a magazine that can help build a movement. And he proves to be a very, very gifted movement builder and editor. And so Buckley starts this magazine, gets an advance on his inheritance from his parents, and they help him, and he proves to be a gifted fundraiser as well. And he recruits editors to staff this magazine, including Wilmore Kendall. And the idea that Buckley has is to sort of pull together various groups on the American right under one masthead, even though they don't agree about everything. He has there's traditionalists in the group, and there's libertarians, and the traditionalists and libertarians don't really like each other very much. But Buckley says, hey, let's get together under the banner of what we don't like, right? We don't like communists, we don't like liberals, and so let's form a coalition, even if we don't agree about it. And so that proves to be he plays a kind of outsized role in forming a conservative movement in the country. And for our purposes, one of the central questions is, what is this movement that he's trying to build? How is Buckley going to position this group on questions of race and civil rights? Now think about when the magazine eventually is launched. The first issue appears in November 1955. But the lead up is in 1954 through 55. And so what's happening in the country, right? We have the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision in spring 1954. We have the lynching of Emmett Till, which gets international headlines in August 1955. We have the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Montgomery bus boycott in late 1955, the rise of this 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King Jr. in 1955. This is all happening when Buckley is launching National Review. And it's not a foregone conclusion that someone founding a conservative magazine in 1955 will take the position that Buckley does. I think that's a really important part of the story to recognize, is that at the time, the leading sort of partisan faction resisting civil rights for Southern Democrats, Buckley is a conservative Republican. Some conservative Republicans that he quite likes, like Senator William Nolan from California, thinks of himself as friendly to civil rights. Buckley has Nolan write the lead article in the first issue of National Review. He actually likes Nolan enough, he wants Nolan to primary President Eisenhower in 1956. But Buckley chooses another course, and it has a big, I think it has a big impact down to today, and how racial politics have played out in this country. Buckley takes the position of resistance, skepticism, and downright hostility to Black liberation. So to start with the conclusion and work our way back to some of the reasoning, the National Review makes it very clear from go that they are against the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision, not just because they think it's an illegitimate action from a court that should be done by another branch. They're against any federal intervention to deal with segregation, period. So whether that's by Congress, by the executive branch, or the courts. They end up being critics of Martin Luther King in almost every way except one, which is they think that economic boycotts are a legitimate form of social protest. But they're critical of King in just about every way. They're critical of the sit-in protesters. They're critical of the Freedom Riders. They're against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. They're against the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And Buckley kind of puts together a crew to help him sort of defend this position of resistance. And I can't talk about all these folks here, but you see Strom Thurmond down in the lower left-hand corner. He was a family friend, Buckley's dad's favorite politician, who would come to the House often in South Carolina. Richard Weaver over there in that corner, a very, very important rhetoric, in the rhetoric world, professor at the University of Chicago, a Southerner by origin. And Weaver, I say to people, Weaver really did philosophically, he defended philosophically everything Buckley's mother ever taught him about race. Weaver had a kind of very sophisticated defense of what he called the Southern way of life. And it was a sort of explicit defense of racial hierarchy that was that had a kind of noblesse oblige built into it. That's James Jackson Kilpatrick, who I was kind of described by his biographer as a leading salesman for segregation. He was Buckley's go-to guy, and Racine sent Kilpatrick down to cover the Little Rock crisis, for example. And he's a really important figure that I'll mention in a little bit. there's time. And then even in the upper right, you see William J. Simmons, who was the administrator of the White Citizens Council. Buckley, the Citizens Council, rises in the aftermath of the Brown v. Board school desegregation decision. And it's described by some Southern liberal journalists and some civil rights activists as the Uptown Rotary Club Ku Klux Klan, right? Same values, different outfits, different tactics. And so they're engaged in essentially, a kind of genteel form of terrorism, right? If they decide you're too friendly to civil rights, they will ruin your life, right? They'll do it through, economic means and other forms of soft power, I guess we could say. But Buckley even cozies up behind the scenes with people like William J. Simmons, which is, was one, to me, was one of the surprising parts of the story as I dug into it, just what was going on there. So Buckley defends these views in a variety of ways, and most famously or infamously in a piece called Why the South Must Prevail in 1957, Buckley takes the position, and I have the quotation, that's sort of the line that is I think most important right here on the front. The white community in the South is entitled to take such measures as are necessary to prevail politically and culturally because for the time being it is the advanced race. Buckley takes that position in the context of the debate of the Civil Rights Act of 1957, and in that piece he's defending essentially jury nullification. He's defending the right of white Southerners to nullify the federal law when it's too friendly to civil rights. So he takes a pretty radical position, and we can talk about the details of that in the Q&A if you'd like. And Buckley's views between 1957 and the debate with Baldwin in 65, they do evolve. They do evolve for sure. And I think that will be part of our conversation tonight, I'm sure. But just to transition to Baldwin, and then I'll play a couple of clips for the debate. And I know your timer, I don't know when your timer's going to go up, but I'm going to, how am I doing?
You're doing really well. You got about 20 minutes.
Oh, wow. Oh, I'm doing better than I thought. Okay. Good. We'll take a sip of water.
About to send you a text.
Oh, you were? Okay. Well, I turned my phone off, so that would make you can hold up a sign. Yeah, so for me as a writer, the moments when I knew there was, I thought, a story to tell here that was interesting and important and worthwhile. But I guess the moment when I thought, wow, I really can't, hopefully I don't screw this up, was the moment when I go from a really deep dive into that world I just described. Really, I maybe 20 pages or so in here where I really try to understand how Buckley and his circle were justifying their position on civil rights. And again, as Scott said, really my goal was to let them speak for themselves, to really try to understand where they were coming from, not without passing any judgment, raising questions along the way, but just really trying to understand the position. So right in the midst of all of that, especially Buckley writing Why the South Must Prevail in the late summer of 1957, that's the moment when Baldwin's coming back to the United States. And he's coming back not to stay forever, but to stay for a while, because he feels obligated to bear witness to the revolution, right? He says, I was over in Paris talking about what was happening in these cafes and things, but I felt like I was not living up to my responsibility. I needed to go back and I needed to bear witness. I needed to give voice to those who could not speak for themselves. And he knew he had this special role to play as a writer, as the kind of poet of the revolution. And so Baldwin, I go in the book from this deep dive into Buckley and his world on race and civil rights to Baldwin in the fall of 1957, sitting in the living room of a 15-year-old kid named Gus Roberts, who's the first Black student in a previously all-white high school in Charlotte, North Carolina. And Baldwin is sitting there with Gus and his mother, and he's saying, he's just looking into Gus's eyes. He says those eyes not only spoke, but they registered volumes. And what Baldwin is he's always obsessed with the eyes, right? He always is thinking about the eyes and trying to give his readers a sense of what the world might look like through the eyes of others. And he wants to try to understand what it was like for Gus to show up on his second day of school and see his white classmates arm in arm, forming a human barricade meant to keep him out of school. What is it like for Gus to walk up and down the hallways and be subjected to verbal and physical assaults? And he asks this question, this haunting question. He says, I want to know what it's like for Gus, for what I imagine is the worst part of his day, when he wakes up and realizes it all has to be gone through again. So Baldwin, brings it down to earth, right, in a way that's so powerful. And so and I think, that moment for me as a writer was just like, there it is, right? I mean, there's, Buckley and his crew coming up with these very sophisticated arguments about these issues. And then there's Gus, right? This kid who's just trying to go to school. And so Baldwin, goes from talking about Gus to talking about, to his mother. Gus, this 15-year-old kid, doesn't really want to say much to Baldwin, right? And he realizes pretty quickly that that's because his mother's sitting there. And his mother was one of only a few dozen parents who even applied for the school integration program. So in a sense, she had sent Gus marching toward that white barricade, right? And so he wants to understand what is it like to be her? What does the world look like through her eyes? What does it look like for her to see Gus leave in the morning, to know what he's going to be going through that day? And Baldwin was really always one of the things that I thought about as I was working on that part of the book. Was Baldwin talks about this moment in 1943 when he's in a church in Harlem. It's during his father's funeral. And he looks around at all these parents in this church and he thinks to himself, what is it like to be, what is it like for these folks to know that they cannot create an armor strong enough to protect their children from the world that awaits? And Baldwin says they are confronted with an impossibility. That's the term he uses, an impossibility. What can they do? So he's sort of thinking through that idea when he's talking to Gus's mother. And then Baldwin goes from there to meet with the principal of the school. And this is a white man who Gus's presence in the school is against everything he'd ever been taught. And Baldwin says, I walked into the room kind of thinking, I'm not going to like this guy very much. But he says, I actually found myself liking him. I thought he was gentle and even maybe a little honorable, but he was also deluded. Right? Everything he had been taught said that Gus should not be in that school, and yet he was confronted with the responsibility of keeping Gus safe, which he did take seriously. And so Baldwin says that principle is also confronted by an impossibility. Baldwin uses the same term, which I thought was really powerful. Is that how is he going to be able to overcome, right, this sense of self, his identity, who he was in the world, has now been totally turned upside down. And he looks at the principal and he says, this must be very hard for you. You're no more responsible for this than Gus is. And he says in that moment, he saw in the principal's eyes, right, a moment of recognition. And I think that's one of the things about Baldwin, the way Baldwin thinks, this radical empathy, right? Think about that being in that room. This radical empathy, he really wants to try to understand what the world looks like through the eyes of this principal and give his readers a sense as well. The heart of the book, I mean, really my favorite, it's hard to, the chapters on the debate, I think are all right, but my favorite part of the book to write and is really this stuff right in 62, 63, 64, prior to the debate. When Baldwin and Buckley are really, as I say, you're in the eye of the storm, right? These two figures by that time are at the heart of these movements. And they're there, not only witnessing this history, but shaping this history. And they're so prolific as writers that, for me as a writer writing about them, I really had a kind of glimpse into their minds almost every day, right? They're publishing all these things, but also their letters. One of the things we need to do when we do historical work is read dead people's mail. And so, reading these letters, right? Reading the memoranda going around Buckley's office at National Review as they're trying to figure out what to do about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, trying to position himself in the Goldwater campaign and so on. And Baldwin going down to Mississippi on January 1st, 1963, and spending time shadowing Medgar Evers, the superhero, if there ever was one, and just trying to understand what is it like to be Medgar Evers or Merle Evers. This couple with three young kids, and Medgar's out every day investigating murders of Black folks because the white folks aren't going to investigate any of those cases, right? So he's out there. Baldwin wants to try to give the world a sense of what that's like. In this period, there's so much that goes on, and I will sort of save, hold in reserve in Q&A. We can talk about any of this. If there's things about George Wallace and Buckley's attitude toward George Wallace or the Goldwater campaign, or Baldwin's kind of, engagement with other civil rights activists, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I'm giving you fodder for questions. And Medgar Evers, Baldwin's engagement with other people on the right. So Baldwin engages in a debate with James Jackson Kilpatrick, Buckley's go-to guy on race. Baldwin sits down with him in late 1962 to debate segregation. Can you imagine that? So all this stuff happens, and there's no question about it, right? There's, one of the things, the mounting tension in the book is like these guys are going to run into each other at some point. They're both rising in their respective movements, and it's just this sort of like, the debate happened in many ways. It shouldn't have happened for all sorts of reasons. It was even canceled the week before it happened, but it still happened. But there was a kind of way in which they were kind of, I don't want to say fated, but there was something here. They were on a collision course. And that, of course, is what we get when we get to Cambridge. And I can certainly tell you more about how they ended up there that night. But again, just to give you before, JD's going to pull up the first clip in a second here, but that night, you have two student speakers, one on each side. And again, the motion was the American dream is at the expense of the American Negro. And then one student speaker on each side, and then Baldwin gets up to deliver his remarks. And then Buckley delivers his own remarks. So they never actually have an engagement back and forth. So it's a particular kind of debate that they have. But JD's going to play a short clip from the Baldwin speech, and I'll say a few things about it, and then the Buckley speech, and then hand the floor over to John.
You suppose that you are too. It comes as a great shock around the age of 5 or 6 or 7 to discover that the flag to which you have pledged allegiance, along with everybody else, has not pledged allegiance to you. It comes as a great shock to discover that Gary Cooper killing off the Indians when you were rooting for Gary Cooper, that the Indians were you. It comes as a great shock to discover that the country, which is your birthplace, and to which you owe your life and your identity, has not in its whole system of reality evolved any place for you. The disaffection, the demoralization, and the gap between one person and another, only on the basis of the color of their skin, begins there and accelerates throughout a whole lifetime. So it doesn't even realize you're 30. And are having a terrible time managing to trust your countrymen. By the time you are 30, you have been through a certain kind of mill. And the most serious effect of the mill you've been through is, again, not the catalog of disaster. The policemen, the taxi drivers, the waiters, the landlady, the landlord, the banks, the insurance companies, the millions of details, 24 hours of every day, which spell out to you that you are a worthless human being. It is not that. It's by that time you've begun to see it happening in your daughter or your son or your niece or your nephew. You are 30 by now, and nothing you have done has helped you to escape the trap. But what is worse than that is that nothing you have done, and as far as you can tell, nothing you can do, will save your son or your daughter from meeting the same disaster and not impossibly coming to the same end. Now,
Thanks, Judy. Just a few comments about what Baldwin said there, and then we'll hear a little bit from Buckley. That particular part of the speech, there's so many parts. It's a 24-minute speech. Baldwin gets up and announces to this group of Cambridge college students that he is there as a kind of Jeremiah. He announces that he is there to deliver a sermon, and a particular kind of sermon. Baldwin left the ministry at age 17, but he remained forever a preacher. It's kind of one of the things that Baldwin always said. And he really does deliver that kind of sermon that night. The Cambridge Union had existed for 150 years. I don't think they'd ever seen anything quite like what Baldwin did that night. It was definitely you could hear a pin drop right in that space. This is a space where students could, like in the House of Commons, right? You can see it's modeled after the House of Commons, meant to be a training ground. And students could rise, to be acknowledged by the speaker for a question. Nobody stood up during Baldwin's speech. It would have been kind of profane maybe to do so. And so Baldwin delivers this sermon, and there's a lot to it, but there's kind of two major pieces. One that I think is highlighted there. Baldwin refers to sort of two broad categories: the subjugated and the subjugators. And that clip that JD has played is one of the things he talks about is the language that jumps out to me is the gap and the trap, right? He talks about the gap, right? There's this gap that exists in terms of it's very evident to you. It's very evident as he's coming out. There is a gap in how people are treated in this world, right? And why does that gap exist? This is the question he's grappling with. What is it? Why do we need that gap? Who's benefiting from that gap? How is that gap related to how people establish their identities in the world? And then this trap he talks about, right? The trap that he says as an individual you can fall into, the trap he saw his father fall into, which is coming to believe that there's something about you as a human being that sort of indicates you deserve your fate, right? Baldwin says that's a trap that can occur for both the subjugated and the subjugators, right? Those who are at the margins, who are made, to believe that they deserve to be at the margins, and those who have done, who fortune has smiled upon, right? That they come to believe that they deserve that as well, right? And Baldwin says that's an even more intricate trap. So he talks about, and then on the American dream, right, as one of the themes of the debate, to conclude that section of his speech, right, by talking about the next generation, right? Part of what we say when we talk about the American dream is this hope that even if our lives aren't as good as they should be, we can have hope that the next generation will succeed where we were not able to. But Baldwin wants to, he casts some doubt on that idea, right, in front of this audience. And then he also talks about the subjugators, right, the would-be beneficiaries of white supremacy, the people who are supposed to be benefiting from this doctrine. And he uses that phrase, white supremacy, in the speech. And he says, these people are victims too, right? And he uses, again, this is an even more radical form of empathy that Baldwin uses in the Cambridge speech. He refers to Sheriff Jim Clark in Selma, Alabama, who at that time is, people are seeing him on their television screens around the world and in newspapers, brandishing his cattle prod, right? Using his cattle prod against men, women, and children who are fighting for their rights. And Baldwin says, when Sheriff Jim Clark uses his cattle prod, what is happening to his victim is ghastly. But what is happening to Jim Clark is in some ways much, much worse. He says, think about the moral life. He uses that phrase, moral life of Jim Clark, right? Who does Jim Clark take himself to be in the world? It's driven by this delusion of whiteness. Like his value in the world comes from his whiteness, as he understands it. And that his role in the world, his sense of responsibility, his sense of obligation is attached to protecting the fortress of white supremacy. And Baldwin says, Jim Clark, in many ways, Baldwin says that he doesn't realize quite what he's doing, right? These webs, the web of delusion in which he's enthralled, he's caught in this web that he doesn't really understand. And so Baldwin says he is a victim. His moral life has been destroyed by the plague called color, is what Baldwin says in the speech. And Baldwin elsewhere would say that, the idea of saving Jim Clark might seem pretty far-fetched, but Baldwin says maybe we can save Jim Clark's children. So that's Baldwin in a moment, I think, of his hope. He was still, the fire next time is not a wish, it's a warning, right? Baldwin is trying to save the country. All right, so there's more to say about Baldwin, but I'll leave it there. So JD, we'll go to that second clip with Buckley. So Buckley, I should say, just before JD starts this, Buckley, listen, it's 24-minute speech. Buckley's sitting there. Buckley says later that I knew it wasn't going to be my night. So Baldwin gets a standing ovation at the Cambridge Union. This was a rare thing for there to be a standing ovation. And then Buckley has to get up and speak. And so here's a little bit of one of it. And this is toward the beginning of his speech.
Which is so eloquently showered upon me. But it is impossible in my judgment to deal with the indictment of Mr. Baldwin unless one is prepared to deal with him as a white man. Unless one is prepared to say to him, the fact that your skin is black is utterly irrelevant to the arguments you raise. The fact that you sit here, as is your rhetorical device, and lay the entire weight of the Negro ordeal on your own shoulders is irrelevant to the argument that we are here to discuss. The gravamen of Mr. Baldwin's charges against America are not so much that our civilization has failed him and his people, that our ideals are insufficient, but that we have no ideals. That our ideals rather are some sort of a superficial coating which we come up with at any given moment in order to justify whatever commercial and noxious experiment we are engaged in. Thus, Mr. Baldwin can write his book, The Fire Next Time, in which he threatens America. He didn't, in writing that book, speak with the British accents that he used exclusively tonight, but in which he threatened America with the necessity for us to jettison our entire civilization. The only thing that the white man has, the Negro should want, he said, is power. And he is treated from coast to coast on the United States.
Okay, so you can see Buckley comes out swinging, and the beginning of his speech, there's a couple things about that are a little mysterious, right? The British accents comment especially is what I have a theory about, but really what Buckley's saying, and the first thing he says, right, in order to treat Baldwin fairly, one needs to treat him as if he were a white man. Buckley starts with that line. Now, what is he after there? Well, we know what he was after because for the next 30 years, he continually wrote about this debate, right? And he came back again and again to this idea that Buckley, I should say, spoiler alert, but Baldwin wins, his side wins, 544 to 164 was the vote. But Buckley never accepts that he lost. He accepts he lost the vote, but he won't accept that he lost the debate. He says that I won the debate, and the students who were voting that night were not voting for Baldwin's arguments, they were voting to affirm his identity. And so they did not take him seriously enough to take his argument seriously. And Buckley says, that's what I'm here to do. Right? That's what he's announcing. I'm here to do that. I'm going to treat him as if he were a white man. That's what that meant to Buckley. I'm going to take his argument seriously. I'm not going to give him a pass, right? So Buckley starts the speech that way. And there are all sorts of ways we might think about that in the context of contemporary debates over race and identity politics and that sort of thing, Buckley's strategy. Buckley also, one of the things that's so remarkable about that little segment, I mean, first of all, Baldwin's reaction shots, right, which would become memes, but there's something about those reaction shots that I think is very, very telling, right? So Buckley accuses Baldwin of threatening America in his book, The Fire Next Time, right? And Buckley, there's a couple lines in The Fire Next Time that especially rank with Buckley, and he uses one of them there. The only thing that white people have that black people should want is power. And that is a line Buckley doesn't usually get the quotations exactly right, but it's close enough. And so one of the questions is, what is it Buckley wanted black people to want, right? And how is that, and why was it so upsetting that Baldwin said that in The Fire Next Time? The context of that quote is very interesting and complicated and important to really know what Baldwin's getting at. But what is it that Buckley really wanted black people to want? The other thing I'll just point out about Buckley's speech is he concludes at the end of his speech, I think most agree that it wasn't Buckley's best night as a debater. But toward the end of his speech, he gets to a kind of more substantive argument about what he sees as the cause of the racial problem in the United States. And so I hear Scott's alarm going off, so I'll leave that hanging as something we can address. Because I do think Buckley has a little bit more of a substantive explanation of his position toward the end of the debate. But I will just conclude with this. There's the aftermath of the debate is fascinating for all sorts of reasons. They end up appearing together one more time. David Susskind, one of the kings of television, upper right of the screen there, sees an opportunity. He knows both Baldwin and Buckley, and he says, I'm going to have them for a rematch. And so May 1965, they sit down for a meeting on Susskind's show Open End, And then a few days after that airs, Buckley declares his candidacy for mayor of New York City. And guess who he talks about during his announcement speech? James Baldwin. And guess who's part of his stump speech? Just about every time, James Baldwin, as a kind of enemy, public enemy number one. And so there's a lot that happens after the debate that's interesting as well. But I look forward to our conversation. Thank you for your attention, and I will get out of the way and hand it over to John. I won't make any faces.
Well, I say they'll get your reaction.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, mine.
All right. Thank you everybody for coming out. I think all the organizers of the event have been thanked a few times, so I'll dispense with thanking everybody again. But thanks to all of you for coming out, and thanks for writing this book. It was really, I enjoyed reading it a lot. Now. It's a very informative and well-written book that, as I see, has kind of two overarching purposes, which came out somewhat in the presentation. One of which is, I think, to explain and to mostly endorse James Baldwin's understanding of what was at stake at the time of the civil rights movement. And then the second purpose of the book is, I think, to explain and to critique William F. Buckley's response to the civil rights movement, and by extension, the modern conservative movement for making a kind of deal with the devil of white supremacy for the sake of electoral gain, especially. I think is that a fair characterization? And I would say I highly recommend this book for anyone who's interested in James Baldwin. I will say, somewhat to my embarrassment, because where I teach, that I'm not actually particularly familiar with the thought of William F. Buckley. But I did look into some reviews, and nobody that knows anything about Buckley, including biographers who wrote reviews of the book, actually challenged the factual accuracy that I found in the book. So there are people who say, well, he changed his mind later, et cetera, et cetera. But so as far as I can tell, it's also a very faithful distillation of William F. Buckley's approach to civil rights and his broader thought. And the question of the relationship between contemporary conservatism and racism is a very complex and thorny and contentious topic that gets people very mad at each other. And since it's not central to the thesis of the book, I'm not going to focus on that in my comments. But I guess that's, if somebody wants to bring it up, it's on the table. I'm going to focus on Baldwin and raise some questions. And here, to put this in context, I'm going to criticize James Baldwin. But I want to begin with an anecdote, which you know the story. So when I was in high school, a member of my community offered an extracurricular night class on African American history, which was not something that was offered at my school. And so I immediately signed up for it and took it. And the capstone project of the course was a research project on a figure from African American history. And to this day, I have no memory of how this happened, but I ended up doing my project on James Baldwin. I didn't know anything about him. I'd never heard of him. And so this is back in the days, really before the internet was much of a thing. So I got on the ferry and I went over to the Seattle Public Library to get some books by and about Baldwin so I could do my research. And I remember, and so one of the books I got was Notes of a Native Son, which is his first collection of essays. And I remember sitting down on the ferry dock, waiting for the boat to go home, and opening up that book to Everybody's Protest novel, which is his sort of critique of Uncle Tom's Cabin, but also Native Son, Richard Wright. And this was at a time, this is in the early 90s, when you had raging this thing that is known to history as the canon wars, the debate over the place of and the validity of the Western canon in liberal education. To kind of turn it into a Punch and Judy show, the debate between, is the Western canon a repository of timeless wisdom about, God, man, and the world that should speak to everybody universally, that is everybody's patrimony, that everybody should engage with? Or is the Western canon a repository of ethnocentrism, Eurocentrism, bigotry, racism, and so forth, prejudiced cultural product that should be challenged and dismantled? And I was very politically minded at that time. And at the same time, I loved literature. And so I was personally struggling a lot with the question of the relationship between politics and literature. I mentioned this, I had a friend, and she said to me, she's like, I don't read books by men. I just don't, right? It's politically objective, just men have nothing to say. And I remember thinking, I'm not gonna tell you not to do that, but that doesn't seem right to me. There seems something, but I couldn't articulate how I understood it, because I agreed even at that time. There's a place where George Orwell says that even the decision to make your book non-political is a political decision. And as he said, all art gets misquoted sometimes. He says, all art is a kind of propaganda, by which he meant every author has a moral point of view, and it will affect what they write, even if they're trying to write something that's pure art. So he says, all art is a kind of propaganda. But then the other thing that doesn't usually get quoted, it says after that, but not all propaganda is art. So I was thinking through this, and I read Everybody's Protest novel, and Baldwin in there articulated better than I had ever seen before or since a kind of vision of art whose purpose is to give an honest account of the human condition, human soul, and thus which is morally and psychologically serious, but at the same time, precisely because it is so morally and psychologically serious and trying to get the human soul right, it refuses to reduce its characters to ideological representatives of political positions. That when you do that, and this is what he claims Richard Wright does, and what Harriet Beecher Stowe does, that you really betray the proper function of art, and you misrepresent human beings by reducing them to that way. So I have never forgot that afternoon on the ferry boat. I mean, I can picture, I can smell the salt water, because that just had such an impact on me. And so I went on to write a paper on him, and I've loved Baldwin ever since. So I don't like criticizing James Baldwin, but at the same time, gotta stir the pot a little bit. So since I mentioned Orwell before, there's another thing from Orwell which I think is sort of helpful for thinking through this. There's an essay that he wrote on Charles Dickens. He says he offers a kind of classification. When authors focus a lot on society and social problems in their writing, they usually fall into one of two categories, which he calls the revolutionary or the moralist. The revolutionary is the one that sees the source of most human problems as lying within institutions and the bad incentives that are created by institutions. Whereas the moralist is the person who sees that the problems in human society are primarily the result of flaws in human nature. The result of this is that revolutionary writers tend to argue that if you want to make the world a better place, you have to start by changing institutions. People aren't going to change until you change the institutions that they live in. Whereas the moralist argues there's no point trying to change the institutions until people actually have a genuine change of heart. Because if you put bad people in good institutions, they're just going to turn them into bad institutions. Right? So the moralist calls for kind of personal reform. The revolutionary calls for institutional societal change. Of course, being judicious, Orwell says they both have a point. But he says, how is it that Charles Dickens can attack every possible institution in England and yet be loved by everybody? Because he was a moralist and didn't really challenge the institutions. He says, how can somebody attack everything and be loved? That's how you do it. So now Baldwin certainly saw institutions as being a major source of problems and a need for radical change in social institutions. But at the same time, he was, in a way, I think, a moralist at heart, in Orwell's sense. And the way I've summarized this, I don't want to go on too long, so I'm almost out of time, is that he grew over the 60s, I think, increasingly pessimistic about what effect the civil rights legislation would have. And as I see it, the reason why is because he thought that changes, legal and institutional changes, were not going to make that much difference until a critical mass of Americans had a fundamental change of heart about the nature of American identity, racial identity, the meaning of race. And I think that's part that and assassinations, right? And you mentioned Medgar Evers. I wouldn't assume nowadays that people know this fate. Medgar Evers was assassinated also, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King. That had a profound effect on Baldwin, but I don't think it clarified his thought. I think his pessimism was in part actually rooted in what I see as, to a certain extent, the excessive moralism that comes from his radical empathy. So he focuses so much on human psychology that at times I think he really undervalued the extent to which the kinds of things the NAACP was doing, for example, was actually going to change people's minds later on. You know, the next generation, you know, like Sheriff Clark's son. He had some hope for him. I think he could have had more hope for him. And so that you didn't necessarily have to start by changing people's system of reality in order to make society a better place. So in that sense, although it sounds weird, I think he should have been, in Orwell's sense, more of a revolutionary than he actually was, and a little less of a moralist. And so it's not entirely clear to me that his kind of psychological way of identifying and diagnosing racial problems and making prescriptions, I'm not sure that he was entirely right about that. And for that matter, I'll just add one other thing. I have a bunch, I know I'm almost out of time. I have a bunch of quotations I was going to read from Baldwin, but I'll leave that out. And just say that one of the impressions that one gets when you read The Fire Next Time and some others is that he has a kind of existentialist approach to the human spirit, which I do think ultimately is predicated on atheism, on an atheistic view of the human condition. And there's a way in which his way of talking about American history and American society does give you the impression that the values and ideals of American society up to that point were so kind of infected by delusion and white supremacy that you almost needed to start over from scratch. And I find that a strange thing to argue, because when you look, and some of this is hindsight is 2020, but he lived until the 80s. The major civil rights victories that are won in the 1960s, and which have profound reverberations to this day, were carried out primarily under the banner of the gospel and the Declaration of Independence. And so I know that Baldwin says in a way he's trying to conserve something, but it seems to me that, since I know your other expertise, I would say I think Baldwin could have learned more from Frederick Douglass than he did about the resources latent already in American society that could lead to greater racial justice. And so that's the last thing I'll say is, I think Buckley is just obviously in this debate. And so I'm just not going to contend that. I think he adopted basically a kind of rehashed version of Booker T. Washington's approach 50 years after the insufficiency of that approach had been demonstrated in the South. So that's all. That's
I have the privilege of going next. First, I just quickly want to say I'm very grateful and humbled to be here. I enjoyed reading this book for many reasons, one of which is that history is how I came to love politics, which is what I study now. So I enjoy the well-told story in this book. The structure of this book fascinated me. Paralleling their lives highlights their differences and their surprising similarities. Their worldviews could not be more different, but both processed the world similarly through their work, being the prolific writers that they were. Both were working from some notion of man as flawed or fallen, although I'm not sure how much Buckley reflected on that for himself. But as a Catholic and a conservative, and Baldwin as a kind of humanist and atheist. And then one thing that came out was just how bold both of them are. I mean, I think you see that with Buckley, but when Baldwin wrote Everybody's Protest novel, he's really young, and he just guns for Harriet Beecher Stowe. It's like, I don't think I would do that. That's around the age that I am now. I definitely wouldn't do that. But I guess I want to focus on their interaction with each other, and for lack thereof, I guess. And with the Cambridge debate, part of it, it wasn't their fault. It was the way that it was structured. But they go on to have subsequent interactions, even just in writing. One thing that struck me was that clip that was played toward the beginning of the debate. Buckley says that he'll treat Baldwin as a white man. He also says elsewhere, I think that this is in one of the writings where he defends the Southern regime. He has this catchphrase, "Let us try to understand their perspective." I don't think he applies that same motto to Baldwin. For example, he, I think, mischaracterizes what Baldwin means by fire. It may be the case that he didn't read Baldwin or read him carefully enough, or maybe he deliberately did this. But either way, there's this nuance in what Baldwin means by fire. It's not a threat, as Dr. Bucola said, but a warning. And I think it's funny that if you read the transcript at the end of Buckley's speech, he kind of goes on to call for actual fire. Like, you know, we will fight. We will bring out our army physically if we have to. So Buckley doesn't apply generosity to his conversation with Baldwin, but I wonder also if Baldwin fails to do the same with Buckley. His whole vision of the world, I think, revolves around love and responsibility. And I have this kind of working theory that this is somehow related to the Brothers Cameron stuff, but another day. Something that struck me when I read down at the cross last semester was just how much a failure to love affects him from his young age to his old age. It just really messes with him, I think. And the way that he sees love is a confrontation. Love is work, something that you really have to put yourself into. I wonder if he fails to apply this radical empathy, if you will, to Buckley. And this is kind of an unrelated but maybe related question. But something else that comes up is the question of what it means to be an American citizen, or what it means to love one's country. Perhaps these are two different questions. Baldwin is deeply critical of America and its people. Buckley, I think, is critical of the critics. And so I think I would say I'm more on Baldwin's side, but maybe Buckley has a point. If you love your country, how do you call out its wrongdoings? And how far should you go? Does Baldwin go too far? I think that's a big question that I'm left with. Anyway, I'm very grateful to be discussing it. Thank you.
How's everyone doing today? Good. I want to say thank you for the insightful presentation and for everyone for coming out, especially in this Zoom as well. So I'm going to start out by just giving a little anecdote. So I know little of Buckley, honestly. It's not this time. However, I remember my AB Lit class back in high school. I did like a research project with Baldwin, so I know like a little bit about Baldwin. So from his book, I resonate with the questions that Baldwin was asking himself as he was writing about his stepfather. Particularly, for example, it's like how does one avoid being marginalized, you know? And for example,
there, like you noted, like what he said in terms of the gaps, it's like why do these gaps exist? Like, why should it be that, you know, someone should be characterized by the color of their skin and not by how they treat other people? So these are similar questions that I've had to struggle with too, growing up. I mean, coming here from Nigeria and just being integrated into in society, I've come to realize that what's more important is how one views themselves rather than how others view you. So, for example, I think that is the key thing to realize in terms of understanding that trap that Baldwin talks about. I think a lot of the times the trap that we do fall into is thinking that we're not good enough. We're like listening to what other people and how other people view us. However, what's most important is how we view ourselves. And I think Baldwin does a good job with that. Because, you know, regardless of his background, he understood to rise to, you know, the occasion and to be in such stage like that. I mean, that's incredible, you know, and inspiring. And then I think, like what noted, in terms of changing institutions, I believe like you can't really change an institution because many people make up the institution. So I definitely agree with the radical empathy that James Baldwin talks about a lot. So understanding how you treat other people is more important in terms of, you know, tackling issues of racism. Personally, like I believe that that racism wouldn't be such, you know, evil if we ourselves were to look inwards and realize how we treat other people. So yeah, and then I think another question that I had to wrestle with is, especially in this current society and political climate, how do we start a conversation and, you know, those ones are like treating people with respect and not discriminating against race or religion, etc. And I think the most important thing in kind of like closing that gap he talks about is just first identifying what the issue is, or you know what the issue is, but identifying how concrete steps, practical ways to close that gap. And I think personally, I mean, there'll always be you know, differences and discrepancies in terms of you know, someone's wealth, but what matters the most is how we can address that. So, yeah.
So it is actually already 9 o'clock. Don't blame our speakers. Blame the timekeeper. I kept hitting pause just so that they could keep going. I was just so fascinated by what they were saying. The conclusion will be right here. Anyway, it is already 9 o'clock. So let me make an executive decision. I'm in charge here. And I'm going to add 20 minutes, but before we add 20 minutes so that we can have discussion, let me just take a 1 minute stretch break. That's all it is. It's not a go outside break, unless you need to go, in which case you'll have your cover, so to speak. So 1 minute stretch break, and then I'm going to add 20 minutes to the clock, and we'll start the discussion. Okay, let's go ahead and come back into session. And what I'd like to do is the following. And let me ask a question of the forum, and any one of you may respond, because there was I thought that Professor Culp raised a really interesting question, which to my mind got confirmed by the two discussants of the interest of it. And that is the difference between the revolutionary and the moralist. I don't mind being guided by Orwell in the discussion, because it looked to me to be a question of whether or not Baldwin loved too much or in the wrong way. And so my question is one about love. How does one love rightly in a situation in which one's rights and dignity and life itself is not being recognized?
Great question. And yeah, it does. I think it pulls together the three discussants really well. Can everybody hear me okay? So I'm still pretty loud. Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I was thinking about, since the question of Baldwin's atheism came up in a couple of the comments. I think one of the passages that came into my mind that is related to the concept of love is from an address Baldwin gave on campus, much like this one, a smaller university liberal arts college, Kalamazoo College in 1960. And there's this, I really struggle with, I don't call Baldwin an atheist, and he's certainly called an atheist plenty, but I think that there's something going on that I don't know if I'll ever figure out, and it may depend on what day we asked him, but he's concluding this address in search of majorities is what it's called, and this is I just want to read a couple lines. I mean, like John, he had all these Baldwin quotes he wanted to read. We could just sit here and read Baldwin all night, and it'd be fine. But yeah, here's what he says. He says this. He says, I suggest the role of the Negro in American life has something to do with our concept of what God is. And from my point of view, this concept is not big enough. It has got to be made much bigger than it is, because God is, after all, not anybody's toy. To be with God is really to be involved with some enormous, overwhelming desire and joy and power which you cannot control, which controls you. I conceive of my own life as a journey towards something I do not understand, which in the going toward makes me better. I conceive of God, in fact, as a means of liberation, not as a means to control others. Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. Love is a battle. Love is a war. Love is a growing up. And I could go on, just keep reading, but I mean, whoa. So I mean, part of that, in terms of, and this goes to Maya's question, I think you got at the heart of what I still feel like I have more thinking to do, and I often find myself thinking about Baldwin, a little bit every day, and this question of what does it mean to love the country in this Baldwin model of confrontation, and does Buckley have a point that there's a kind of confrontational form of love that can become destructive, right? And I really struggle with that question, because I think part of what I see Buckley doing is, I think Buckley's understanding of love is very much a kind of devotional sort of love. And he's very uncomfortable with the idea of confrontation being at part of, essential to our definition of what love is. And I think, and this is what has me thinking about the root of the word patriotism, right? And the sort of idea of father, right? Think about these two guys and their fathers. And I think that there's something going on there where each of them can see. Baldwin, I was telling the group last night, Baldwin writes this novel that's on the mountain, which is a damning indictment of his father in so many ways, the soul of his father in a way. And Baldwin later in life calls it a love song for daddy. And so, whereas Buckley, when he's thinking about his father, he would never write a novel like that, about his father. So, but there's something going on there about how they think of what it means to love the country, right? So that's kind of a word salad, but there's something where I don't know what to think about that question.
Others?
So, can you guys hear me?
So for me, I think love is kind of like how Dr. Rico said, it's more devotional. I think it's putting someone first before yourself. So I think we can learn obviously a lot about love from Jesus, and how he, lived his life and laid his life for us. And I think Jesus is truly like the prime example of what love is, because Jesus is God. And I feel like just daily, daily lives, we can kind of show love to other people by how we treat each other. Just learning to accept people who they are. And just loving them regardless of what they do, in terms of obviously, if you do bad, you can't love that bad. Like, you have to learn to separate the action from that person, and just learning to love people throughout their faults. I think that's the core of what love is, because God does that to us every day. So.
I wonder if it's a mix between this devotional love and confrontation. Because I think, I can't remember where in the book Dr. Nicole mentions it, but Baldwin talks about being invested. And so that's what devotion is being invested in someone. And I don't think that means that you always have to go along with what they're doing, If we think about God's love confronts us in ways. It causes us to examine ourselves and examine how we relate to the world around us. And so I don't think that they can be separated from each other, these two types of love.
Professor Cope, one of the things I really found compelling about your point about Baldwin's pessimism, which I think is quite perceptive, the pessimism of the disappointed lover. I think that actually that articulates what I love about Baldwin. The prophets didn't save Jerusalem. And what I find compelling about Baldwin and disturbing is his suggestion that America is a tragedy. And that's not the story we tell. And so I guess my question to you would be, would he miss the prophetic fury that might save us if he backed off, indicating that we might very well not be saved at all?
No, I mean, it's a good question because no one writer can do everything, like be equally suited to and persuasive in every mode, right? So Baldwin is not constitutionally made to be an uplift writer. I think, because at the core of his, as I see it, at the core of his project is like with the question of love. Like if you start with start with kind of like a scholastic definition, right? Of love as willing the good of the other. That is a very important part of what Baldwin, I think, understands by love. And in the first place, what it's motivated by, I believe, is his sense that hatred and resentment make it much more difficult, if not impossible, to see the truth. Your own, the passions in your heart distort your mind. And Baldwin was very much concerned with making himself into a kind of person who is capable of recognizing the truth. And he sees it partly by divesting himself of the kinds of passions that made his father what his father was, and what was making other people in his community into what they were, and what was making Sheriff Clark into what he was, and all the characters in The Fly and the Buttermilk, which you talked about. And at the same time, he recognized also that those delusions that people have and that they hold on to not only are a source of blindness, but are a major source of why we do what we do to others. And so that's the part of the drama of the human soul that I believe his history, his talents, and his dispositions drew him towards. And so in that sense, that kind of prophetic mode, I mean, that's where he works. But even there, I think there is a way in which being in that mode can blind you to other things too. So, this question of, because at the end of the day, the question is like, is America a tragedy or not? And I think that, Baldwin's warnings might not have been as efficacious if he was sunnier in his disposition. And the same thing, that doesn't mean that the efficacy of his warnings mean that his viewpoint is actually vindicated. I do think, I think there is an element of truth, although we talked about this last time, I'm still not convinced that Buckley actually read The Fire Next Time. Because I only saw him quote a couple things. So I think he listened to Kilpatrick, right? About
Gary Wells.
Oh, was it Gary Wells?
Yeah.
But when Buckley says, what Baldwin is saying is not that we've betrayed our ideals, but that we don't really have ideals, right? And, in reading Fire Next Time, that's not an unfair takeaway necessarily. When you read some of the passages in it, there's some extremely damning passages in there that personally I think are unwarranted. So I'm not, I admire his power and his perceptiveness, but he's right by that. That's one of the areas where I don't think this is one of the areas where I don't think he was right about everything. I kind of evaded a direct answer. I'm sorry about that.
Well, we still don't know whether we're in tragedy or not. I will tell you though, having thought that some tragic possibilities were merely historical, only to discover more recently that they're not. I myself have been drawn back to Baldwin and his pessimism just because I like the truth. And I have to leave it as an open possibility that our original sin, so to speak, as a country, may very well destroy us. I thought that could not be the case until 2008. And then I thought, well, maybe. Professor Buchholz, would you like to respond? And then I'd like to...
Yeah, I'd be happy to open it up. Folks have been waiting patiently, I'm sure.
I'd like to start with students. Yes.
So, y'all mentioned a lot Baldwin's radical empathy, and you also mentioned how he could see through the eyes of even somebody like Buckley. And however, you mentioned that Buckley might be somebody who's too far to save, in a sense, but that his children might be. My question is, what would Baldwin's argument be for how we go about saving Buckley's children?
So did everybody hear that okay? Yeah. Well, I think part of what I think the answer to that question might be is that, I talked a lot about the radical empathy aspect of Baldwin's thought, but I think, as we see in the quotation that I just read from In Search of the Majority, there's also a kind of radical confrontation. And I think that, one of the things I argue in the book is that Baldwin, although he could have radical empathy, and I think Maya makes some good points, did Baldwin show the kind of charity to Buckley that he could have? I think that's a good question. But I think Baldwin thought, when he confronted people like Kilpatrick and Buckley, that one of the ways he might save their children is by exposing them for what they were. And it's kind of remarkable in the case of Buckley, right? Because part of what Baldwin does with Kilpatrick, for example, there's no recording of this that I've seen, but if anybody finds it, let me know. Late 1962, Baldwin is invited onto the show The Open Mind to debate James Jackson Kilpatrick, who had just written yet another book in defense of segregation. And it's right, they sit down with each other right after the Battle of Ole Miss, this sort of armed insurrection to keep James Meredith out of the University of Mississippi. And Baldwin sits down with Kilpatrick, and they're welcome to the show. And the first thing Baldwin says to him is he says, "Mr. Kilpatrick, do you think there's a difference between men like you and those people who are out in the streets committing acts of racist violence?" He says, "There is no difference. Indeed, I hold you far more responsible than I hold those people. They're caught in a web of delusion that they don't really understand, and you are weaving that web for your own gain, for your own purposes." He says, "You call yourself a conservative. The only thing you're interested in conserving is your own power." That's how Baldwin starts the show. But so I think that, and I think there was something going on with Buckley as well, where he, when he confronts Buckley, in Cambridge, and then again, when they have this TV sit down, Baldwin writes this piece called "The White Man's Guilt" a few days after the second sit down with Buckley. And I argue in the book, and I think I have some evidence that he doesn't mention Buckley by name, but Buckley was on his mind. And it's Buckley. I mean, there's this radical confrontation also. What is it that is inhibiting this person from coming to terms with his history, right? And I say all that to say, I think there's something about that. And you think about Chris Buckley, Buckley's own son, who has been very nice, by the way. I mean, I'm very nervous to have him, read the book, but he's been very, very nice. And, Chris Buckley's an interesting case, right? He's somebody who, doesn't necessarily repudiate. He's still defending his father, absolutely, as a human being, but, in his own politics, came to kind of repudiate a lot of the legacy of his father, I think. And so, yeah, I think that radical confrontation is part of it. And then the radical empathy thing, I think they have to be together, right? That's, I guess the way I would respond to Maya's question is that there has to be a kind of radical empathy alongside a radical confrontation and an appreciation for how things like a belief that human beings are created in the image of God, the ideal of the Declaration of Independence, how those can be indeed very much alive and can be part of the revolutionary project, right?
Yes, this is working. So with the question of Baldwin's pessimism and the supposed tragedy of America, because I remember I watched a lot of the reruns of William F. Buckley all throughout my life, and the first time I ever heard anything about George Wallace was his debate with Buckley in '68, and they are clearly in opposition in what is meant by conservative, for example. Wallace takes a hardline stance, and Buckley takes a very different sort of view to this. And what I thought was interesting was, to one extent or another, the question, is the American dream at the expense of the American Negro? Both in their own ways, Wallace and Baldwin would say yes. And the type of conservatism that was beginning to grow in the 60s, people like Buckley, people like Barry Goldwater, and then later I think people like Alan Bloom, who I greatly admire, had a different view that rather, regardless of whether historic injustices did exist, that liberty and justice for all could come about as an organic development from that. And so that's, I think, is there something to that type of moderate conservatism contrasting with that, and something perhaps noble about William F. Buckley, that he's trying to avoid that type of fire that Baldwin talked about, and that Buckley also said, well, we're going to fight back with that. Was he trying to avoid that and trying to say, how can we rather let it organically develop? Is there any merit to that?
Yeah, thank you. I don't know if I'm the first one to jump in. I think that's a really excellent question. And I do think that Buckley's self-conception is very much consistent with what you said. I mean, that Buckley really was trying to come up with a respectable kind of position of a kind of a moderate, respectable, conservative opposition to moving too fast on civil rights. And I think, he makes that very clear 10 years on after National Review's been founded. He says that's kind of what the goal was. Now, I think that, and he does that at Cambridge, right? He refers to Oakeshott. He invokes Oakeshott. Don't make politics as the crow flies. And there's something about that I, in my own, kind of ideological development over years, there's something about that sort of argument that's powerful. It seems, consistent with like history, recognizing the flawed nature of human beings, and that, one can become too much of a revolutionary and really forget about the sort of things about human nature that cannot be changed. However, I think that there's something about Baldwin, right, that becomes a very, as a lens through which to view that argument, where it starts to be, it becomes harder to accept, right? If Baldwin is looking, into the eyes of William F. Buckley as he's making these very elegant defenses of a kind of moderate conservatism, it's very hard to accept, I think, and very reasonably to say that, I say in the book that, one of the slogans of the civil rights movement is freedom now. I say Buckley's slogan for the civil rights movement is some freedom one day when we decide you're ready. Mm-hmm. Well, if you're I know you're skeptical, but I think if it's the we, or maybe freedom, maybe I can drop the some, but the we, right? This is why the South must prevail. Who's the South, right? There are a lot of Black people in the South, right? The South, the assumption built in to Buckley's defense of the idea of human beings being created in the image of God, the Declaration of Independence, all these different things, there's a kind of assumption built into it that doesn't really count Black people as full human beings. That's my argument. So, and that's, I think that, I can see a good argument for moderation, for gradualism, and so on. But I also wonder if, and this is what the point Baldwin makes in the debate is, would Buckley, it doesn't say Buckley explicitly, but would Buckley be taking this position if those were white people being brutalized in the South? I think that's a legitimate question to ask, right? But I'm with you. I think that is, you're getting at the heart of one of the things, and I myself struggle with that, my own politics and just as a philosophical question as well.
It's almost 9:30, so I'll make my second executive decision, and that is to conclude. I do want to say that Professor Bukola is willing to sign books. I've got one for you. So, but also to take questions and converse with you. I also wanted to point out that he's already writing yet a third book on Martin Luther King Jr. and Goldwater, which I very much look forward to. Before he signs books and converses with people, though, Please join me in thanking all of our speakers. What a marvelous evening. We're in your debt, and especially our guest,